Right. So this is your hidden storytelling skills. It's lesson 3, section 3. This, of course, is spring 2023. And so for an opening circle, let's do something you've gotten so far from the class and something you especially want from the class that you may not have gotten yet. You got those 2 questions in your mind? Something you've gotten so far, something you especially want from the class? I'll hide that so we can see each other better. Who will
Okay.
go first? Go ahead, Sarah.
So I really enjoyed last time the application of the slider to text, to the Rapunzel story,
Oh,
and
good.
really was interested too in the idea that there was only one part of it that was a blow by blow, and the others were spread out over the others. So I'm really interested in terms of the class of the other sliders that we'll be talking about and how to apply those to works.
Sweet, sweet. Give me 1 second. I am trying to place. Open my place to. Oh, there it is. I don't have my place to write notes, which I'm habitual. As a longtime coach, I'm always having to write. So give me 1 second. Sorry, I didn't do this before. Let's see. No, it's good. And this will be note. And this will be hidden storytelling skills, lesson 3, section 3 in today's date. Sorry, I should have done that in advance, but I didn't. And there she blows. Get rid of all this other garbage. Don't need to see it. Okay, so I think I've gotten all the garbage out of the way. Apologize for not having that done before. And who hasn't had a chance to say hello?
I'll go real quick because
Welcome aboard.
I'm gonna go. I have to go run and pick up my daughter, so I will have my video off for probably most of the at least first half of this call.
Good.
So I'm Joel. What have I learned and what am I taking? What trying hard not to just repeat what Sarah said. I did also really enjoy the application of the first slider to text. I thought it really kind of brought home. I guess let me be a little more granular and say I really liked how you had these sort of these waypoints on the spectrum between show and tell,
Right.
and then I liked how we sort of, in breaking down the text, illustrated the fact that sometimes things can fall in between these waypoints, but everything can be sort of put on this spectrum, and it really started the process of kind of thinking, being more deliberate in choosing where to show versus tell, and illustrated how both are appropriate. So I really like that, and I really can't say anything other than what Sarah said, in that I'm very interested to hear about the next slider, or the next several. So
well,
that's me.
Today, if you weren't part of a previous section of this lesson, you will get your wish. Anybody else need a chance to say hello? Oh, Lorraine, there you go.
Well, I needed to pare down this story so that I could tell it in 14 minutes or less. and I tend to just walk around and walk around in a scene for a really long time. And so I was visual, which is fine for the development, you know, but then, and so what I did was I thought about the concrete actions and I just
Mhm.
visualized it in my mind, you know, what the character was doing. And that helped me figure out what I felt were the most important elements in the
Whoa,
story.
whoa,
So what we've been learning really helped me with this story.
sweet. I'm writing it down. The most important elements. Absolutely. That's the goal of all this. You know, the goal isn't to analyze. The goal is to analyze enough that we become aware of our choices and that we
Yeah.
can make the adjustments. And eventually that becomes second nature. You don't have to think about it as consciously. But it's nice to have them because we're developing, you know, a series of different sliders, which each represents a different kind of adjustment. And it's very easy to get to rely on two or three and then forget the others. And there's no requirement to use the others, but sometimes when you're struggling, it's like, oh, maybe I should be looking at that other one, and it's like gives you another way to approach things rather than just being stuck. And if there are other ways available, it's nice to have them available to us. Let's see who didn't get a chance to say hello. Sue.
Uh, well, I appreciate the slider. It's still, and maybe it's because the what I'm writing is a little bit different,
Mhm.
but I really appreciate hearing from others about how they're working with the slider because that helps me also.
Right. That's right. Here, absolutely. And
Uh,
again, sorry.
yes, it's me.
Oh yes,
I
please, Isabel.
mm, I was amazed how I can use the slider for self-developmental work with myself.
Oh, say more about
And
that.
yes, and how abstract some of my stories were, and now I'm going to no to the to make them more concrete and how it helps.
I love that. Yes, and, you know, you don't know what you're doing until somebody helps you notice it, and then you have the choice to adjust.
Yes, absolutely.
And just having it as a choice, not as a thou shalt, is huge. It's huge because whatever you know, whatever is thou shalt for one story is probably thou shalt not for another. So just being told what to do is not really that useful. But being able to learn how to adjust what you do, now that's what great storytellers always do, generally unconsciously. So to be able to make that conscious, if it's if unconsciously is working for you, which is how most people who do well do it, that's fine. But then when they teach, they don't know how to teach it because they don't know that they know it. Or they assume they know it and they have no idea how to help you. So this is all attempts um, to tap in, make a conscious the choices, and then give you the option at every moment in every story to adjust the choices as you will.
Mm.
And to me, that's highly empowering.
Mhm.
It's meant to be highly empowering. And it means that you're in charge. You have choices that you didn't know you had because we all have habits and things that sound, well, this must be this way. No. Let's see. Sarah, did you have a chance to say hello?
I was first.
Oh, sorry, you were first. Good. Um, is there anybody who's on who hasn't said hello? Joel said hello. He's on the video, but well, welcome aboard then. And let's see, making sure that I really am recording. I am recording, good. And I will show some slides. So let me share that. And so what's in this lesson? We have our 3 layers of skills that painters have. The upper layer composition skills, remember those. And the key task or goal at that level, just reviewing, is to make the painting meaningful and coherent, which, as you know, is no small thing. It's just not the only thing, right? The key tools for making it coherent are deciding what scene to paint, who's going to be in it, where is it going to be set, what happens, why, and how, all that stuff. The mid-layer composition skills, the key task or goal is to make the painting, in this case, engaging, vivid, and evocative. The key tools are the rules of composition, including the sliders, hue, saturation, lightness, sharpness, and all that stuff. The foundation layer skills, the key task or goal is to make this story, or the picture rather, visually comprehensible. And the key tools there are the drawing skills, the brush skills, the paint mixing skills, the basics of making something, painting something, the very basics. So those they work together. To me, it is somewhat enlightening by itself to realize that these are all there, they all work together, and that if you struggle or something isn't quite right, you get to choose which of those you think might be the one to adjust. And so that gives you an enormous amount of awareness and flexibility that otherwise you might not have. Now, again, there are people who are great storytellers who've never analyzed this to this detail, never need to. They know it intuitively, and that's fine. It's just for when they come across something, which they might, that they don't know how to fix, then they don't know it because they only have intuitive. Or the rest of us who can benefit from at least some of these being conscious, under our conscious control. So the concreteness slider, we dealt with that in the first lessons. And this is the rundown of it. And from now on, when we get a new slider, we'll at some point meet what I call this rundown. So the first part of the rundown is what kind of actions, right? And in terms of concreteness, the first level of action that we're dealing with on our spectrum is that there's no action in the story at all. That's what we call abstract. The next level, getting slightly more concrete, is a non-specific action. The next one is concrete, which is one or more distinct concrete actions. And then the blow by blow, which is a series of concrete actions that usually might also be described as a single action. So again, these bands on the spectrum are not in the nature of the world. They're in the nature of us creating bands in order to be able to refer to them in the same way that the rainbow does not have 5 or 6 or 7 distinct bands in it. It has a continuous adjustment from one end to the other. And we as humans create these labels to be able to refer to things. And the labels are incredibly useful. And we need to remember that they're just sort of arbitrary bands that allow us to describe things. And that at any stage you can move slightly from one to the other, or you can move enormously from one direction to the other. And that's the nature of this stuff. And so we are creating these bands not because they are essential to telling stories, but because they help us become aware and adjust. And that helps us creating stories and make them. So which kinds of these include action detail? The abstract does not include any action or action detail. The summarized also doesn't include action detail. It includes an action, but no detail. The concrete can include action detail because it's one or more distinct concrete actions, and so there might be detail, or there to some degree or not. The blow by blow always. It's a series of concrete actions that all add up to one action, and that always includes some level of action detail, or it's not blow by blow. next level, can you draw it in any sensory mode? So drawing is visual, but we mean, can you represent it as a sound or as something else? And so abstract, can you draw it in any sensory mode without making some arbitrary decisions about which concrete actions to include? In other words, do you have to make it more concrete to just be able to do that? Or can you actually draw it as it is? And in terms of the abstract, no, you can't draw it or do it, represent it in any other sensory mode. It's too abstract. The summarized, no, also you can't. It's non-specific. You can't draw something that's non-specific. You can take that and say, oh, I'm going to add some specifics, but then it's no longer the summarized thing. Concrete, yes, there are distinct concrete actions, and so you can definitely draw it. And draw in the is visual as the example, but of course it can be any other sensory mode. The blow by blow, can you draw? Yes, and that's the easiest to draw because it is the most concrete actions and it's often a series. Now you won't draw it if it's a blow by blow, which if you're talking about the whole series, you may need to draw each part, but that's okay, right? Could you follow the instructions to do something without making arbitrary decisions about which actions to include? So this is just another way of approaching the can you draw it thing. So if I said, do this as an instruction, so could you follow the instruction to do it? And in the abstract, no, there's nothing to do. You can't tell a person to do it. Summarize the same thing. I could tell you climb the tower, but there's so many things that are involved with that. Or I can tell you go get Rapunzel, but there's so many things that are involved with that you would have to make a whole lot of decisions before you could do it. So you can't just do it at that level of concreteness. A concrete statement, yes, you can follow the instructions. The specific enough, there's action enough that if somebody says, go have breakfast, you could have breakfast, and so on. Blow by blow, well, of course, if you can't follow the instructions to do these series of concrete actions, then you can't do anything, right? So just understand, just to have in your mind that when you move from one level of concreteness, in this case, more concreteness going to the right as it's drawn today, things become possible that weren't possible when you move to the left. Some of the specifics are less possible, but you get other benefits. Does it move the narrative forward? Does an abstract statement move the narrative forward? Now, if you look at the top part of it, there's no action in the statement. Well, you can't possibly, right? So the answer is no. An abstract statement does not move the narrative forward. It doesn't represent any action in the story. Is it part of the story? Can it help the story? Absolutely, but not by adding action. A summarized action, a non-specific action, yes, it does move the narrative forward. You had breakfast, sweet. Concrete, absolutely. Blow by blow, of course. All right. One more layer to this rundown, summarizing all the aspects and characteristics of the concreteness slider. What kind of statement can it be replaced with? So an abstract statement can only be replaced with another abstract statement or just omit it. You can always omit it, and it doesn't change the narrative. It changes information about or hints and suggestions about how we might interpret the narrative. But you can only replace it with another abstract statement, or you can just omit it. What kind of statement can a summarized statement be replaced with? Either blow by blow or concrete. The other two of the three. The same thing for the concrete. It's either blow by blow or summarized. The blow by blow can be replaced by concrete or summarized. So these three on the right hand side of the chart as we have it here, those do the same thing but just in different levels of concreteness. So therefore you can replace them. And that is really powerful. you could read and go to a lot of classes about how to tell stories and never get it that you have the choice to replace something with something of more or less or no. Well, you can't really replace it, but you can add something of no action, no concreteness. Any questions or comments on this rundown here? From now on, when we have a new slider that we learn, we'll also get a rundown to go with it, just as a way to get all the stuff we know about it in one place.
I have a question about the abstract.
Oh yes,
Uh,
please ask.
Can you say more about inability of not drawing it? Because I think it's possible to draw something abstract.
You can make an abstract drawing, but then you're not. The point is it concrete enough that you could actually draw the thing itself? Right. So draw me a picture of uncertainty. You could draw a picture that has some of the qualities of uncertainty, but you can't show it to me in a picture. Right? Where to say, draw me a picture of having breakfast, you could do that. So we're using the terms about drawing in that sense. Does that clarify it all?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. Any other questions or comments at this point? We'll go on. Oh yes, Sue.
So, it sounds like with the abstract, okay, so we're talking about the physical versus the mind, the rationale, and then it also sounds like it requires emotion.
Oh, the abstract.
Abstract has, there's no emotions with abstract, so it's all about the body and emotions that get conveyed, one would say, both in the story as well as in the painting.
So say one more time about the emotion.
Well, it seems like just in your response to the question about abstract.
Yes.
Okay, so my abstract statement is that it has to involve the emotions as well as the body and emotions rather than the mind. For that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, the abstract statement has to. I don't quite follow where you're going with that. Can you give us an example or something? I believe you went to something. I just haven't.
But you were talking about painting. You were talking about painting a feeling of, I forgot what the word was, but it was an abstract painting of a feeling.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. Well, I mean, you could do it, but it sounded like, from my understanding, it's easier to do what people are actually doing and how they're feeling
That's right.
rather than the feeling itself.
Yeah, those are different things. Those are different things. And
Right.
the abstract statement can describe a feeling, but it doesn't describe any action.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Did that clarify it? I think you're absolutely onto something. I'm just trying to help you
Yeah.
be clear on it for yourself.
Okay. So the abstract can be about the feeling,
Absolutely.
but you need to but it needs to be portrayed through action. Am I understanding it that correctly?
Well, when you make an abstract statement, there's no action in that
Right,
statement.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you want to portray an action, you've got to use one of the other statement in one of the other three categories.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And this is all by way of giving us a vocabulary. So when we see these different kinds of statements in a story, or we consider making them in a story, we have a way to name them, and we have a way to realize, oh, I can make it slightly less abstract by making it summarized. I can make it even less abstract than that by making it concrete. I can make it totally not abstract by making it blow by blow. And this is all the concreteness slider. Now, this is in this lesson we're going to learn another slider, which has this whole other world. Does the same kind of thing, but not for concrete actions, but for something else.
Okay,
And
great.
so this slider isn't the whole world. It's just one dimension of what happens when we create, hear, and tell stories.
Mhm.
And again, we're just doing it so that we have a way to notice, so that we can adjust, and we know what's possible to adjust. Again, most great storytellers learn to do this unconsciously, and so when they give advice, they have a name for it, but they don't understand that someone who hasn't already discovered what they're describing can't get to it from the name. And that leads to all this confusion that you'll see, especially on the web, but books and everything. Great questions, great comments. Anything else before we go on? Going? Okay, let's go ahead. So we have these 4 bands on the concreteness slider, right? And the examples for abstract: to live alone, you need to be able to feed yourself. Right? There's no action in the story there. Summarize: John had breakfast. Yeah, you can do that. Go have breakfast, you would know what to do, but you'd have to make some decisions about what actually to have for breakfast and where to have it and so on. Concrete: John ate a bowl of cereal. If I said, go eat a bowl of cereal, you could do that. You'd have to make some decisions along the way. Where you're going to eat, what bowl you're going to have, what kind of cereal, and so on. But it's still much more concrete. There's fewer decisions left to you. And then blow by blow, pick up your spoon, dip it in the bowl, then bring it to your mouth. That is ever more concrete and determinant of what's happening. It's still a band. It's not, you can still get more detailed than these examples. But again, we're just like a rainbow. Very awkward if we have to say. I have the rainbow coming up. So the thing to remember is, even though we're delineating these for purposes of categorization, then the reality is a continuum, and each blends into the next. And so in a rainbow, the same is true. Here is, you see this here, these colors. Now, there's no real place where red and orange are distinguished. We have an arbitrary thing, which is for convenience. We say that if it's below 484 terahertz, then we call that red, and if it's above 484 terahertz and below 508 terahertz, then we call it yellow. And those are just as arbitrary as abstract, summarized, concrete, and blow by blow. These are useful. It's nice to be able to say, make it a little bit more green. I have what a lot of men have, which is a kind of red-green color blindness. And it's not that I can't see red and I can't see green, but they don't contrast for me as strongly as they do for other people. So Pam will say, see the berries on that tree, and I don't see the berries. I have to get close to the berries, or do this little trick of focusing before I see the berries, because the little bits of red don't stand out for me against the green the way they do for somebody else. And that's not, that's just human differences. That's not a disability, really. I mean, it can become a disability in a world that expects you to do that. But if the world didn't have those expectations, it wouldn't be a problem. If my way of doing it was the world's expectations, you'd all be able to do it, and you'd wonder why we didn't do that other stuff. It's the same thing. You see how that's similar. So moving along, the 400 terahertz to 484 terahertz, we define it as the band for red, but that distinction between red and orange is arbitrary. It's for our convenience. Same is true with abstract, summarized, concrete, and blow by blow. They're arbitrary. They're for our convenience. Nonetheless, there's a difference between red and yellow. Right? And there's a difference between abstract and concrete and so on. All right. So recognizing the four bands in Rapunzel, we've done this before, but let's go over it quickly. Every evening, the prince visited Rapunzel in her tower, but such secrets are hard to keep. One day, the witch discovered Rapunzel's deception. The witch climbed up the tower and grabbed Rapunzel. In her anger, she seized Rapunzel by her beautiful hair, struck her several times with her left hand, and then, grasping a pair of shears in her right, snip, snap, the beautiful locks lay on the ground. And she was so hard-hearted. He took Rapunzel and put her in a waste and desert place where she lived in great woe and misery. At this point in the course, especially with this example, you know that we've started less blow by blow. We've started in the concrete action, but in the summarized form. And we go down into the detail, nitty gritty, and then we come back to the summarized. And that is typically true, which is another reason that the advice always be concrete is ridiculous. Because if everything is concrete, nothing stands out. Because these things, only one thing is really a blow by blow, that stands out. And you make that stand out not only by making it blow by blow, but by surrounding it with things that support it, but are not blow by blow. So we have this sense of zooming in and then zooming out. And that's good. If you're driving along the highway, and you see something you want to look at, you kind of zoom in on it and you look at it in particular, but you're not paying attention to everything at the same level, because then you wouldn't see anything at the same level. All right. So just a little bit more with what we've been doing before, recognizing the four bands. So we'll take each phrase or sentence and place it on the concreteness slider. Every evening, the prince visited Rapunzel in her tower. Is that abstract, summarized, concrete, or blow by blow?
Summarized.
It is summarized, absolutely. There's action, but we don't get any detail to it. So summarized. But such secrets are hard to keep. What's that? Somebody else. Lorraine, looks like you want to say something. I'm trouble. Yeah, go ahead, Lorraine. You're still muted, I think.
Abstract.
Yes, such secrets are hard to keep. There's no action at all, right? It's an important part of the story, because this, in this case, a little sense of portent, right? And knowing that secrets are going to be an important part of it, but no action, no actual characters or settings were disturbed in the making of this statement, right? One day, the witch discovered Rapunzel's deception. What's that? Abstract, summarized, concrete, or blah, blah, blah. One day, the witch discovered Rapunzel's deception. Would you do?
Summary?
Go ahead.
Is it that summary?
It is summary, right? Because we understand it, but how do you draw it? You have to make a lot of very concrete choices to be able to draw it, or to say, go discover Rapunzel's deception. Huh? Right. So that is clearly summarized. The witch climbed up the tower and grabbed Rapunzel. What's that?
Is that concrete?
The witch climbed up the tower and grabbed Rapunzel. That's right. It's a concrete action statement. It's certainly not a summary. It's or abstract. It's not a blow by blow, because it's just this one thing. So well done. So we got as far as those first four. In her anger, she seized Rapunzel by her beautiful hair, struck her several times with her left hand, and grasping a pair of shears in her right, snip, snap, the beautiful locks lay on the ground. What's that one?
Blow by blow.
Blow by blow, absolutely. Classic blow by blow. It's a series of actions that sort of add up to one action, right? She cut off her hair. that would be the concrete action statement that would take the place of this, but this goes into the details of how you do that. And she was so hard-hearted that
abstract.
Absolutely. There's no action in there, right? It's describing a quality of her, which is a good thing, but it's not action. So it's in the category, it's in the band of this spectrum called abstract. Um, um, she took Rapunzel and put her in a waste and desert place.
Concrete.
Took her and put her in a waste and desert place. I call that summarized.
Mm.
Now, anybody want to justify why I might call that summarized as opposed to concrete? And by the way, there's no penalty for getting it wrong. The only way you're going to get it right is when you get it wrong and they understand the difference. So you did exactly the right thing, sir. I don't want anybody to believe that there's something wrong with getting it wrong. There's something wrong with not trying and therefore not getting it.
Right. So put is an action. So that's why I said that.
It is an action. And if you're going to draw her, putting her in a waste and desert place, what would you draw?
A person in a desert scene.
But
That you're saying that's after the fact. I get it. Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Yes, that's a very good way to say it. Thank you. I didn't have the vocabulary in my mind, but I think you nailed it.
Okay.
Clear for everybody? Again, there's no fault in struggling with these because it's an arbitrary thing and we're not used to thinking in these terms. So you get to do this as many times as you need to until it becomes second nature, and it will. It will. She took Rapunzel and put her in a waste and desert place. Is that where we're up to? So what's that?
Can I have a
Finish that.
question?
Oh yeah, question. Here's the question.
So this
Yes.
sentence that doesn't move the action forward is because I don't get it.
Which one are we talking about now?
She took Rapunzel and put her in a waste and desert place.
Right. So does that move the action forward or not in your mind?
No, maybe because I'm picturing this in my mind, it moves the action forward.
Right. I mean,
To me.
before this statement, she wasn't in the waste and desert place. Now the action in the story has put her in the waste and desert place. It's not described in any kind of detail, but it is action, which means it's what we call a summarized statement.
Okay.
She was so hard-hearted, there's no action.
Mhm.
Just a state of being, right? There's no action in it. Getting clear? There's
Yes.
no shame in struggling with this because it's just these are arbitrary bands on a spectrum. And it's helpful to be able to say, oh yeah, that's in that category, because they do have some meaning. There are these qualities that we give to them. But you weren't born. There's nothing in the nature of God's plan, as far as I know, that creates these four particular pieces of terminology.
Oh man.
So where are we up to? She took Rapunzel and put her in a waste and desert place. Have we done that one yet? We have. So that's clearly a summarized statement.
Yeah.
She's taking Rapunzel, she's putting her in a named place. So there's action there, but it's not specific action enough for us to. How did she take her and put her and things like that? Those are high level descriptive verbs. Where she lived in great woe and misery. Where does that fit on the plan?
Summarized.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say so too, because it is about what's happening. And if you imagine the story going on from there, she lived there, in great woe and misery. And then one day, right, and now we're about to go into the concrete. And so these all have their function. There's not a better or worse about these. There's just the choices. And as you can see by this example and other examples we'll look at later, typically you don't do all of one or the other. Typically, if there's something really important, you're going to make it blow by blow, but you're going to lead up to it with summaries and abstracts and concretes. And then you're going to lead away from it with summaries and abstracts and concretes. And that's what makes it stand out. If everything is blow by blow, nothing stands out because everything is so specific. Which could be what a goal you'd have for a whole scene or even maybe longer. But if that was a whole story, we might start to feel that we didn't get enough summary to go quickly for what wasn't worth spelling out, or that we didn't get enough abstract statements to begin to have things that would help us understand what's going on, as opposed to just describe what's going on. Questions or comments on this? I think you got it. And it's okay to just keep coming back to it. These are things you just have to apply yourself to. Eventually, it'll be second nature, but until then, it'll be not second nature. Going. Okay, moving along. Oh, so these two in this particular excerpt, there are two abstract statements. And if you think that, well, abstract don't have enough, don't have any action in this, so they must not be important. Well, I mean, to be sure, that middle one, this blow by blow, is longer, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Out of 8, 2 of them are abstract. And that's because abstract helps us zoom in and zoom out. Then summarized, half of them, or 4 out of 7, are summarized. And so summarized is kind of the default setting in a way. I don't want you to think about it necessarily that way, but it is the thing that when you're moving action forward, you summarize unless you need to make it a blow by blow, or if you need to make a comment, in which case you move it back to unless you make a concrete or blow by blow, or you want to give information about the action, and therefore you do abstract. It's all starting to feel like, oh yeah, I get it, I get it, I get it. Questions or comments on this as a whole? Wing. Come on, let's go ahead. All right. So I noticed that in this section, there's only 2 statements on the concrete half of it. There's only 1 concrete and 1 blow by blow. And they're right in the middle. Now I chose the segment, of course, but still, this is this does comprise an episode of the story. And so it's starting with the summaries and the blow and the abstract. It's moving into the concrete and the blow by blow, and then pulls the camera back out into the abstract and the summaries again. So that isn't, we've all been told to be concrete, and often that's good advice in the sense that we're not concrete enough. But if you just take that advice, you're doing as bad as if you never were concrete at all. So just as the painter adjusts light and dark to make the most important figure stand out, the storyteller adjusts concreteness to make the most important action stand out. So any questions on that first slider before we go on and review the second one? Or take it, I forget it, where we are. So going with Rapunzel again, in her anger, there's that one little phrase that sort of doesn't fit with anything else. What do you see why that's a different kind of phrase than any other phrase in this whole section? It's because she's describing the emotion by itself. In her anger, and then we get the action. We're saying that this is how she felt when she did it. And so that's a different thing, right? And it's not describing action, it's describing something else. So instead of in her anger, she sees Rapunzel, it could be in her jealousy, or in her confusion, or in her fear, in a moment of madness, right? In her thwarted love. So all those tell us one thing. What are how would you describe what these all have in common in terms of what kind of a thing are they adding to she sees Rapunzel?
Emotion.
Emotion. Yes. Um, I they are talking about emotion, but that's a very very good answer. Um, I will go on to say that 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 the
No.
this in this case the emotion is telling us how to react to the rest of the sentence. So it is in my opinion, functionally it's more about how to react, and the emotion is the secondary way it teaches how to react. But based on this example, the other answer would be equally valid. Just
And
not,
Doug, it's interesting that it could be totally left out, and that the phrase, and we still get it. You
yes,
know,
right, and it's because of the blow by blow that we get
yeah,
it right.
exactly. Yeah.
Right. She sees Rapunzel by beautiful hair, striking her several times, grasping a pair of shears, and the beautiful locks lying on the ground. That doesn't say how she was feeling or anything like that, but it makes it clear how she was feeling, right? It portrays how she was feeling. And that takes the place, as it were, of inner anger, inner jealousy, inner confusion. All right, but there are times when we want to add that inner anger like phrase because it you know to go to the blow by blow just to get the fact that she was angry could make that take too long, right? So it might not be important that she began to breathe harder and she clenched her jaw and her eyes began to bulge out and her face turned red. I mean, that might be what's happening, but it might not be worth the time it takes to say it that way. It might just be more
Okay.
efficient to say in her anger, right? And in a different story, it'd be a different choice, but in this story, this seems like it was a good choice. Oh yes, please, Sue.
So would you say, well, in this sentence, so the witch's reaction to what was happening causes, because you were saying down here, it says it tells us how to react. So would you say that the witch's reaction ultimately, based on your sentence, tells us how to react?
Yes, yes. She sees Rapunzel by her beautiful hair and cut it off.
Mhm.
That doesn't tell us by itself. The word sees is sort of an gives us a little bit of interpretation, but it doesn't tell us by itself. Is this an act of aggression, an act of helping with grooming? Right. But when you add in her anger or something like that, now we know this is not just being helpful. This is losing it. This is aggression.
Mhm.
Lorraine, do you have your hand wanting to go up?
Yes, I was wondering if directly stating the emotion can give us a hint or as to the motive of
Yeah,
the character or the
absolutely.
intent. Like if you start out with in her fear, she seized Rapunzel and did all
Exactly.
of that.
Right.
It would make me wonder. Well, is she afraid for Rapunzel? Is she doing this
That's
to
right. Exactly.
try to protect her?
To me, you're describing that perfectly accurately. That's what in her anger or any of those substitutes does for us. It gives us an idea of how to interpret her motivation for doing it in this case. And that's useful for us. And you could do it, you could do that in more detail if you wanted to, but in this case, it seems like it's quite apt to just say in her anger, she did this. In a desire to um, um, uh, to prevent Rapunzel from, being raped by the prince or something, there would be a different motivation for cutting off her hair.
Mhm.
And so inner anger does a lot. It modifies the intention of what's happening here. Anything else before we go on? Lorraine, is that something on the tip of your tongue?
No, I was just thinking about if you start out with in her thwarted love,
Yes,
I guess I would wonder if she's secretly in love with Rapunzel and
exactly. Right.
is angry with her for for
Yes.
not reciprocating or
Yes. And notice how just in her thwarted love, that's just 4 words, but it starts us thinking in that direction. And so that's a choice you
yeah.
always have. You can get us going in a particular direction with just 3 words, 4 words. Now, if it matters exactly what she looked like when she was, angry, then you might want to have more detail. But the this degree of concreteness um, is
Mhm.
it's sufficient to do what in her anger does. That adds something by itself and doesn't take up any more space than 3 words. And yet it does help us know how to interpret what's going on. Anything else before we go on? These are great questions and comments. This is exactly the grappling that you need to do to make this fully your own. And that's my goal is to try to give you what you need to do that grappling, and you're being very cooperative. Thank you so much. And not just cooperative, but engaged. Going on then. Inner anger tells us how to react to the rest of the sentence, right? It tells us how to understand or think about it, how to react or feel about it, how to interpret it, what uh, uh, it being what is being said. So this inner anger is not about concrete action. It's about something else. It's about interpreting the actions. And that is going to suggest a new slider because we've been dealing with the concreteness of the actual actions. We haven't been dealing with the cues that tell us all this other stuff. And that has its own slider, which is what we're going to get to today. So this continuum of interpretation, which we'll call the interpretation slider, I believe, goes from pure description on the one hand, where there's no interpretation, which is most of our Rapunzel story in that thing, all the way to explicit interpretation, where we say something like inner anger, right? So John ate a bowl of cereal slowly, pure description. John ate a bowl of cereal resentfully, explicitly telling us how to interpret that bowl, eating the bowl of cereal, how he does it. Making sense so far? John's mother stood rigidly behind his chair. Now, the rigid helps us know physically how to imagine it and what it might feel like being to be in her body, but it doesn't interpret the rigidity. Is it because of concern? Is it because of being on her feet too long and her lower back is hurting, and let's just she holds her stomach in? So that's pure description. Explicit interpretation of that might be something like John's mother stood menacingly behind his chair and menacingly tells us how to interpret. So this slider goes from pure description where there's no interpretive language to explicit interpretive language on the other end. And as you can tell by the way I've drawn it, there's going to be a middle band on this as well. Notice that we had, I think, 4 bands on the concreteness, and I don't think it's useful to have. You could make 12 bands of any of these, but I think 3 is sufficient for the interpretive slider. So John's mother watched him eating. Your description doesn't tell us anything about the what's or the whys or the how. It doesn't help us interpret what's going on. John's mother scrutinized his eating. Oh, now we know what's going on, right? Now we know a lot about how to interpret the fact that she's watching him. So the interpretive language slider goes from interpretation, zero interpretation, to what I'll call +2 degrees of interpretation. So we really are just dividing this band into two, this continuum into two bands. And one end is 0. Obviously, in the middle is going to be +1, and in the other extreme is +2. And that's enough. You could do it to 12 degrees, but I don't think it would be useful. You spend more time trying to remember what's the distinction between band 10 and band 11, or is that between 11 and 12? That would take you more time than it'd be worth. So explicit interpretation is this thing where, as we said, the action is being explicitly interpreted. The pure description, there's no implicit or explicit interpretation. John's mother impatiently shoved John's hand to his mouth. We get exactly what's going on there. John's mother quickly, it's just description. Furious, John seized her wrist and savagely bit it. So now, seized and savagely bit. That language, there are, those are two verbs, but those particular verbs carry with them a sense of interpretation. It's not just she grabbed and bit or put in her mouth or something like that. We're getting the seized and savage as explicit interpretation in the language. John grabbed her wrist and bit it would be pure description. And we don't know if it's playful. We don't know if it's hostile. We don't know if he's doing it because she got bit by a spider and he's he's trying to get the poison to bleed out. We just know that he did what he did. That's pure description. In the explicit interpretation, the furious seized it and savagely bit it. The word furious, seized, and savage all point us toward interpretive language there. Now, starting on the explicit end, John's mother, aware that something was broken forever between them, walked from the room with a heavy heart. So the action there is that John's mother left the room and walked out of the room. But aware that something was broken forever between them is telling us how to interpret what's going on. And with a heavy heart is telling us further how to interpret what's going on. So far, so good. John's mother left the room is the same action minus all the explicit interpretation. So you see how these two sliders are independent of each other. You can have, pure description all the way to blow-by-blow action. And at each level of that, you can have pure description or explicit interpretation or what we'll have in the middle. So those are completely independent of each other. In the same way that where you go left and right and where you go up and down are independent of each other. They both matter. And if you go up high and off to the right, that means something or implies something, but those are separate things, going up or down or going left or right. And that's exactly what's going on here with each of our sliders. And now we have a second one. As soon as we have a second one, we have the possibility of how they interact, and that's going to be part of the fun for today. So implicit interpretation is what I call the middle band in the interpretive language slider. And I call it the interpretive language slider rather than the interpretation slider because it is really about the language you're using. You're using language to assign interpretation to it. So that's the most accurate description of what this slider is about. Pure description, John ate a bowl of cereal slowly. Explicit interpretation, ate a bowl of cereal resentfully. What would be in the middle? Where there's a hint of the interpretation, but it's not explicit. And here's an example. John ate a bowl of cereal sluggishly. Now, slowly and sluggishly are similar, but sluggishly has a little bit more intention attached to it, doesn't it? You know, it's it has a quality. In both cases, the bull is being slowly, but sluggishly gives a little bit more interpretive language, interpretation to that slow skating. Is that making sense so far? Doesn't have to be 100% solid, but you're with me so far. If you're not, speak up. Happy to bring you on. Okay, moving along. Pure description. John's mother stood rigidly behind his chair. Oops. Rigidly behind his chair. So rigid is it has a little bit of interpretive quality to it, but you know, it could be rigid because she was just like that, or it can be rigid because her back hurt, or it could be rigid because she'd had several vertebrae fused or whatever. But so I call it pure description in this case. Um, uh, Explicit interpretation might be John's mother stood menacingly behind his chair. And the menacingly certainly tells you what to think about her standing behind the chair, right? The rigidly gives you a little hint, but it doesn't really tell you enough to know how to interpret that. What might be in the middle between stood rigidly and stood menacingly by? It's okay if you don't have an answer, but just I want you to just take the moment to struggle with it. That effort will help you in the future if we get into it more.
Well, I don't know if attentively would be, it doesn't indicate negativity, but
Yeah. But, tentatively, yeah.
attentively.
Attentively. Oh, attentively. Yeah, I think it's back in the pure description part.
Okay,
In the sense that she was paying attention. We don't know if she was paying attention
yeah.
you know, in frustration or in joy or whatever. But so I think coming up with these questions is really important, because that's when you learn, right?
Yeah.
So good for you. I would put that as a different example of pure description, and knowing that is part of the process of getting getting a handle on this. Any other ideas for an implicit way to interpret John's mother standing rigidly behind his chair? You don't have to do this, but I think the effort of struggling might be useful.
How about John's mother stood behind the chair, gripping its back?
Gripping its back. So is there an interpretation there? Or is it just physical description?
I don't know. Gripping its back, well, firmly, but I don't want to say angrily yet, because that's menacingly, right?
Right, exactly. So in my mind, gripping its back is just part of the physical description.
Another description.
It-
Okay, I'll be quiet now.
No, you don't have to be quiet. No, I don't want you to be quiet. I want you to say those things so that we can help you figure out how it all works. So she stood rigidly behind his chair. What was the thing you said? She stood something behind his chair.
Attentively was the first one, and
Yeah,
gripping
good.
the back.
Oh, gripping the back of the chair. So that's just a physical thing. We don't know if she's
Yeah.
gripping it in frustration, in a sense of physical insecurity. We don't know how or why she's doing it, but we know she's doing it. And so that would be still pure description until we begin to apply some kind of sense of interpretation. Okay. So, what would be an example of something that might be implicit interpretation? John's mother hovered behind his chair.
Mm.
You see how that is not as pure description as stood rigidly? Hovering has a little sense of an emotional quality to it, but it's certainly not menacingly. This isn't as explicitly uh, uh, ex, explicitly interpreted as menacingly. So hovered again, that gives us a sense that she's um, uh, kind of looking a little bit at scans, but it doesn't nail it down. It just pushes us in that direction. Make sense of her?
Yeah, although
Please, sir.
I'm thinking that the middle ones, we can't draw them. I mean, hovered is like, again, could be helpfully or menacingly, moving that way. So
We can draw them, but we can't know exactly what the intention was.
true, but how is hovered then different from rigidly?
Stood rigidly. In my mind, stood rigidly doesn't do anything to suggest the quality of the standing rigidly, except for this rigid. When you hover, in my mind, now these are debatable because English words are quite flexible, but in my mind, hovering behind the chair suggests that there's a quality of observing him somewhat critically.
Okay.
It doesn't make it explicit, like stood menacingly behind the chair.
Yeah.
It's explicit, but hovered. Well, she's paying attention. She's somehow making her presence felt there for some reason, and we don't know exactly what it is, but we're starting to interpret this differently than if she just stood rigidly behind the chair. Good. These are the things you have to say and try in order to grasp this. So there's actually you get 10 points for a right answer and 50 points for a wrong answer. Because it's the 10-point answer will affirm you in what you're thinking. The 50-point answer will help you understand what you need to understand.
Yeah, thanks.
Keep it up. I know that for me, it's hard for me to make an answer a question in a group that I know is probably wrong. I got so accustomed to being the expert. It's a disease. It appears to attack men more than women, but it can attack women as well. All right, so let's take another example. Pure description. John's mother watched him eating. Right? There's no indication of interpretation there. It's just the actual action. Okay. What would be an example in explicit interpretation about how she's watching him, why she's watching him? Take a stab. Again, we're not caring about right answers, we're caring about noticing the differences.
Well, you gave us John's mother scrutinized his.
Good. So give me another one that's sort of in that end of thing. What takers? Is this hard? So we're looking for explicit interpretation, right? Well, here's what I have. John's mother scrutinized his eating, which I guess I said before. So scrutinized it is a subset of watched, but it's watching with a sort of a suspicious or preventive quality to it, right? Scrutinizing something is not something that's done delightfully. It's done a little bit menacingly, to borrow that word from the other example. Okay, so what would be right in the middle between John's mother watched him eating, your description, John's mother scrutinized his eating, which is explicit interpretation. Lauren, you got something halfway? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, don't have to share.
John's mother, oh boy, I forgot. Just it just left my mind. John's mother, oh, I forgot. I forgot suddenly.
It's okay.
Let's
If
see,
you remember again, either write it down.
John's
Good.
Oh, John's mother uh, focused all of her attention on his eating.
Yes, that's a lot more like scrutinize, isn't it? It's a really intense watching. It's not a casual watching. It's not a delighted watching necessarily. It, focusing all of her intention. So yeah, you're over in somewhere in this explicit end of things. Well done.
Okay.
Good for you. Anyone else want to try one? Trying and failing is as useful as trying and succeeding, actually more so.
Maybe observed. John's
Uh,
mother observed him
Observed.
eating.
yes, John's mother
Yeah.
observed his eating. So
Yeah.
does that tell you anything about um, uh, the how we would interpret or watching him eating? Does that shade that
Yeah.
in terms of intention in some way?
Could we even say carefully watched him eating?
Yes. So I would say that
Yeah.
observed is either the same band as pure description, or it's moving a little bit in the implicit direction, but it's not quite there yet. And what did you say, Sarah?
Carefully watched him eating.
Carefully. Oh yes, now we're getting a little bit more there, right? So
Mhm.
that has some interpretation in it, because it tells us about kind of how she's doing it, which implies a little bit of why she's doing it. Something about that is going on there. And so that would fit somewhere between implicit and explicit. And it's not crucial right now that we make that distinction. Good. Anyone else? So implicit between.
What about John's mother noted how he ate? I'm also changing the tense there a bit.
She did what? What? How she?
She noted how he ate.
Noted how he ate. Yes. Yes. That is telling you something different from just watching him. It's interpreting it more, right? Noted. Now we don't know if she notes it hostilely or appreciatively, so it would be in the implicit interpretation then. Good example. Well done. And again, there's nothing wrong with not getting it yet. The point is to just keep trying and noticing. So, oops, hit the wrong thing. So John's mother evaluated his eating. Right. So this is giving an idea that she's evaluating, but we don't know if she's doing it before or against. So it's an implicit interpretation. Making sense? All right. So this language, this slider has 3 bands on it. It makes sense for us uh, to describe pure description on one end, explicit interpretation on the other, implicit interpretation in the middle. John's mother quickly guided John's hand to his mouth. John's mother abruptly moved John's hand to his mouth. That's a little bit more sense of intention with it, right? And then John's mother impatiently shoved John's hand to his mouth. We got a lot of sense of how this, the interpretation will give to the guiding the hand. Making sense? John grabbed her wrist and bit it. John seized her wrist and sank his teeth into it. Furious, John seized her wrist and savagely bit it. So you see how these are lined up on that continuum. And, if we were going to be fussy and try to distinguish between sort of implicit and more implicit and neutrally implicit and really, really, really implicit or something, we could fuss with it. But I think it's enough to recognize these 3 bands to be able to be aware of what we're doing. One more. John's mother slowly walked from the room. John's mother slowly walked from the room. John's mother walked somberly from the room. What would be an explicit interpretation? About how she walked in the room.
John's mother stomped out of the room.
Stomped would definitely be in that direction. Another way of adding interpretation with a dependent clause here. John's mother, aware that something was broken forever between them, walked from the room with a heavy heart. And so I put that one in there because it's a little different than the other ones we made, but it's exactly an example. It is still, in my mind, an example of explicit interpretation. So it's not just changing a word, although it can be. In this case, it's adding a whole clause and then more things with a heavy heart phrase there. So is this making sense to you? You may not be able to categorize accurately and quickly yet, but you do see how this is a continuum and how the differences, what the effect on the listener is of those differences. Different effect, John's mother slowly walked from the room, to John's mother walked somberly from the room, to going further, John's mother, aware that something was forever broken between them, walked from the room with a heavy heart. And of course, a little less interpretation would be John's mother walked from the room with a heavy heart. That would also be explicit interpretation, but I piled it on there just so you can get it, that it doesn't have to just be the verb. It can be a clause. Any questions or comments on this at this point before we move forward? You're doing a great job. I'm very proud of you for trying this stuff, noticing. Trying it wrong is as important to learning it right as getting it right is. Often more important is then you begin to understand, oh, I see how that's different. And that's what you're looking for, is to understand the differences, not just to make lucky guesses. Although lucky guesses involve some less conscious intelligence behind it, so there's nothing wrong with it. All right, so the rundown of the interpretation slider, right? So does it use language that interprets the action? Pure description, what's the answer going to be? Does pure description use language that interprets the action? No, it just describes what happened, right? I can't remember if, yeah, so implicit interpretation. Does implicit interpretation use language that interprets the action?
A little bit.
A little bit, yeah. It uses language that indirectly interprets.
Oh.
But indirectly, which is the same thing as what you said. It's maybe a little bit more precise, but we're describing the same thing. And then explicit interpretation, does that use language that interprets the action?
Yes.
Yes, it uses language that overtly interprets. All right, so these are our descriptions of the three bands. They're the equivalent of the frequency numbers in the rainbow. Right, and like in the rainbow, where the bands get close together, they go imperceptibly into the other. And so, again, this is not, describes what happened is one thing, and there's a hard border between that and uses language that indirectly interprets. Rather, we're moving from orange yellow to yellow orange. Right, so there's just the shading happening there. And when you get right in the middle of the shading, it's really hard to tell, is it yellow or is it orange? But the point is to be aware, what you're going for is the skill to say, I want that to be less interpretive. So what will I do to do that? Or I want it to be more interpretive. Or I want it to be baldly interpretive. And those are the things you want to be able to do. Those are the adjustments, and when you can make them, it will make your writing more effective and more efficient. All right, ready to go on? So next question, does it use language that explicitly interprets the action? Well, you know what the answer to this is going to be, right? Pure description, of course, doesn't. Implicit doesn't explicitly do it. It's explicit that explicitly does it, okay? Who does the interpreting? Is it the listeners, the narrator, or the listeners sort of in conjunction with the narrator? Who does the interpreting for pure description, or for explicit interpretation, or for implicit?
So say the choices again, please. Of who does the interpreting? You said writer,
listeners,
listener,
narrator, or a combination of both.
Well, pure description would be the narrator, I think.
pure description would be the listeners, actually.
The listener?
Pure description, then the narrator is not.
Oh, I was thinking narrator as writer. Sorry. Okay, got it.
I don't know that it might be any different if it's right or not.
Writer, the writer.
Yes.
That's different.
Anyway, the point is that when it's pure description, the listeners get to do all the interpreting, because the writer or the narrator or whatever is not interpreting it for us. That's just what it means to be pure description. Okay. Who does the interpreting? So the listeners do. In the case of pure description, in the case of the implicit, it's sort of the combination of those. And in the case of explicit interpretation, it's the narrator, the teller, that does the interpretation. Making sense? And one end, we're leaving it all to the listeners. The other end, we're not leaving anything to listeners. And in the middle, it's a middle kind of a mix. Moving ahead, can it be used with any level of concreteness? Could pure description be used with any level of concreteness? Could explicit interpretation be used with any level of concreteness? Or implicit interpretation be used with any level of concreteness? And a hint here is, if you think of these two sliders as being at right angles to each other, because they don't directly interpret together. You can have things at high concreteness and high interpretation. Things at high concreteness and low interpretation, and so on. So can it be used at any level of concreteness? Yes. Pure description can be used at any level of concreteness, and can implicit, as can explicit. So the level of concreteness and the level of description, interpretation, are independent of each other. You can have something in any of these three bands that goes with any level of concreteness. And that's cool. That means that we've done something that in the world of mathematics is an orthogonal. You know, where north and south are independent of east and west. Right? If the only two things you had was east and west, and northeast to southwest, or whichever way, it might be this way depending how you're seeing it. So now, when you have the choice of going, if it's just north or south and east or west, then however north you go or south you go, it doesn't interpret this, doesn't influence this. But if you're doing the angle this way, where you're going from southeast to northwest, then as you change one, you're changing the other, right? And so that's a different thing. So the orthogonal or the right angle thing is the way to have terms that are independent of each other. And that's good language, that's good math, but it also matters in terms of writing and language, where we have a lot of in-betweens, but we still want to have a way of naming things where one is different than the other, that are separate. Does that make any sense to you? Are you confused enough to want to know more? We're going to come back to this, so I'll give you a visual graphic of this. So next, final question. Is there an interaction between one of these levels of interpretation and concreteness? Do they change in some way when the action is more or less concrete? That's a good question. I don't expect you to have the answer to that because you've never thought of it before. But in terms of high concreteness, like blow by blow, it's easier to suggest an interpretation without using interpretive language, because you get to have all these other little action verbs and so on in there that add up to something that suggests an interpretation. Whereas when you're at low concreteness, you only got room for one or two verbs, and it's not enough to really tell us the hows or the whys. Does that make any sense to you? If it's a little too abstract for you, don't worry about it. We'll get it in the actual picture later on. Sarah, were you saying something?
It's very confusing
That's confusing.
because
All
the
right.
concrete I mean, whenever you say concrete, it seems like that's not interpretive.
No,
So,
concreteness and interpretation are completely independent of each other.
okay. And you said that, I know, but it's like the words are there, so,
Is it hot or cold, and is it raining or not?
okay.
Those are two independent things.
Yeah.
It can be hot and raining, hot and not raining, cold and raining, cold and not raining. And so that's what I mean by
Oh, I see. Okay. And I get
Right.
what you just did. Yeah.
so this little gesture of these two lines means that you can go up and down however much you want without influencing where the position you are right to
I
left.
see. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And this so um and if you're doing high enough concreteness, then you can suggest an interpretation without having to use interpretive language. Because if you keep telling enough about what the person is doing, we start to interpret it just from the
Oh, I see.
different
Okay.
combination of
Yeah.
those. Right. So that is an interaction with concreteness. If you get highly concreteness and highly concrete and do enough of it, it's starting to have some of the effect
Mm.
of implicit interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, implicit interpretation. This is sometimes easier at high concreteness, depending on the availability of indirectly interpretive words. Now, our vocabulary is a determinant here, because we can say angrily, and we can say something else, but there's just so many words we got in between that suggest an in between. And if there aren't enough available to us, then it gets harder to do. So our vocabulary can be a limiting factor we can't just arbitrarily do all these all day, because sometimes we don't have the words for them, or we only have a few words for them. Is that making sense? If it's not quite, just keep it in your mind, and we'll come back to it. So interaction with concreteness at high concreteness, the pure interaction with pure description, it's a little bit dependent on interacts with implicit, because you might just not have enough words. You know, liked to, hated to. Well, those are good, but what's in the middle? Sort of liked. Was somewhat pleased. We run that. We don't have an infinite number of words that will place us on that, and so that can have an interaction. And then finally, interaction with concreteness. Directly interpretive language is most often used at low concreteness. It's not. It can be used with high concreteness, but you're more likely to do this interpretive language, this directly interpretive, when you're operating at low concreteness. And I'm not going to try to explain why it's not worth it. But does that make what I'm saying make sense to you, at least in some hypothetical way? Questions or comments while you got the floor? Going? Fine. Okay. So now we get to go finally and go back to the thing we started talking about, which is show, don't tell. And what we learn is that concreteness goes from the abstract, in this case on the left-hand side, the way I drew it, to blow by blow on the right-hand side, the way I drew it this time. And so concreteness is on that linear scale. Interpretation is on a scale between pure description, which I'm putting at the bottom here, and explicit interpretation. Because I have that right angle, you can go to any level on the up and down without changing the level on the side to side. So that means that this whole square, anywhere in this square, you're having some more or less interpretive language and some more or less description. So somewhere between blow by blow. So we're drawing it so the blow by blow is in the lower right, and abstract is in the lower left, or is in the right to left, is not necessarily lower. So blow by blow is anywhere on the right hand side, abstract is anywhere far on the left hand side, but interpretation, if you go higher, you're getting more explicit interpretation. If you go lower, you're getting more pure interpretation. So if you choose a place anywhere in the square, it's going to have one level of interpretation and another level of uh, explicit or implicit or pure description, implicit interpretation or pure description. So that says right. You're going to have interpretation at any one degree by the up and down, and you're going to have concreteness somewhere by where you are right to left. So at any level, I don't know if you can see my hand. You can't see it, but I'm moving my hand across the middle band from top to bottom, right from right to left, moving it across. And so anywhere you go on that, left to right, you are in the middle of interpretation, halfway between explicit and interpretation and pure description, but you're going from low interpretive language to higher, really, really high interpretive language as you move across. So what does this tell us? Well, if pure description, if concreteness goes from abstract to blow by blow on the left to right, and pure description to explicit interpretation goes from down to top, then anywhere in there, if you put your hand right in the middle, it's going to be right in the middle of concreteness and right in the middle of interpretation. If you put your hand right in the middle of that left-hand thing, then it's all the way over to abstract, but right in the middle in terms of interpretation. So you see what I'm saying? So this, if you're not used to reading graphs like this, anywhere you put your finger in this square here is a place that has a given level of interpretive language, depending on how high or low it is, and a given level of concreteness, depending on how right or left it is. So you're understanding how I'm setting up this graph, right? Because that's important, because we're going to have a big discovery if you understand that. Are you ready? Hold your breath. So telling, so see, in the left, it's low concreteness and low interpretive language. In the lower, in the upper right, it's high concreteness and high interpretive language. Back over in the upper left, low concreteness, high interpretive language. Back down in the lower right, low interpretive language, high concreteness. Right? So wherever you go in this, you have a given level of each, and it's different. So telling, as we use it, is actually low concreteness and high interpretive language. That's what people mean by telling. They're not aware that that's what they mean, but this actually is what they mean. And if you go over to the lower right, where it's high concreteness and low interpretive language, that's showing. So showing does not have a high level or maybe even no level of concreteness, but it is, no level of interpretation, but a high level of concreteness. Telling is low level of concreteness combined with a high level of interpretive language, which is why people can't place this on a simple continuum, because it's not a continuum, it's a square. Square, you get to move in two directions, and anywhere in the middle, you get different answers. So treating it as though it's a continuum, one continuum, is frustrating, confusing. No wonder nobody can figure it out or make good use of it. Lorraine, did you have a question or a comment? You're muted still, Lorraine. Lorraine, you're muted.
No, I'm just doing the gestures to
Yes,
feel
sure.
to feel the chart.
Exactly.
That's what I'm doing.
Right, and so one goes up, one goes down, but also you go to anywhere on the square, and wherever you are is a given level of concreteness and a different given level of interpretive language. I mean of interpretive language. Right. So you can you say I'm 3/4 the way up on uh, interpretive language, and that puts you somewhere. You know, if you drew a line, 1/3 of the way up, a horizontal line, that would be the line of this particular level of of interpretive language. But then if you put it, if you intersected that with another line, there would be a level of one level of concreteness that goes from different levels of that. Then wherever those crossed would be a point on all this. And so you don't, it isn't an either or, it's a two-dimensional problem. So it's some of this and some of this. And when you add them up, a little bit more of this, a little bit less of this, that puts you somewhere on the square. And that is what we actually adjust as writers and storytellers. Now, the math major in me is like over the moon about this. Because it accurately describes something that people have been describing fuzzily, inaccurately, and misleadingly. So I know that reading a graph like this may be a foreign language for people, but just keep in mind, you make two decisions. Is it low concreteness or high concreteness? Where is it in the middle? Is it low interpretive or high interpretive or somewhere in the middle? And whichever one of those whichever two of those you choose, it puts it at some point in the square. Lorraine, do you have a question or something, or you're just drawing with your finger?
No, it helps me to do the movement. It helps me understand.
What do you think I'm doing? You can't even see what I'm doing, so I'm doing it for myself.
Oh.
Take a moment to take this in.
Oh,
It explains something that has been completely obscure until now. Any comments or questions before we move on, or do you want to just look at it a little longer? It's up to you. I don't care. Oh, Sue.
So, okay, so when I look at this and, you know, you said telling is low concreteness, high interpretive language. So that is like a key, you know, because it gets us, I think we spoke of it like in the first or second session, you know, where you want people to empathize or, yeah, I guess that's the right word, empathize, get into the feeling mode of whomever.
Right.
Right?
Yes. And you don't want that at all every moment, but you want to be able to do it, right? And you want to be able to control how much to do it.
Okay.
And we've been people talk about showing and telling as though it's a single line, and you can go from one end to the other end or places in the middle. And it's so confusing. So few people really get it because the description is wrong. It's not a single line. It's a square. Anywhere in the square represents more of one or less of the other.
So much as I'm tired of John, can we take examples from
Absolutely.
the stories and put them in the four?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You had an example in your mind? Or
no, I just was trying to look back and see, but not yet.
Anybody have a sentence of any kind? It can be one of the John ones or whatever. and we're going to look at where it fits on the concreteness scale and the interpretive language scale, and therefore, with those two data points, we'll know where it fits in the square.
So John ate a bowl of cereal.
John ate a bowl of cereal. Good. So, is that abstract or concrete?
Concrete.
It's concrete, and it's not blow by blow, but it's the next most concrete thing, right? So the concreteness, which goes from left to right here, is going to be pretty to the high side, so it's going to be over to the right end of this square. Right?
Okay.
And good. And so, how does what was the sentence again? John ate a bowl of cereal.
Right.
Where does that fit on the level of interpretive language?
Not, let's see, it's,
Right? Is it entirely? It's as low as it gets, right? There's no interpretation.
yeah.
So therefore, it's going to be on the to the left end here, over low uh, uh, low of sorry, which is which. Low is going to be say what the sentence was again.
John ate a bowl of cereal.
Unable here. So that's pretty high concreteness. It's not all the way to blah blah blah, but it's going to be over on the right hand side of concreteness, which goes
Right.
and in terms of interpretive language, it's very low. So it's going to be at the bottom over to the left. Somewhere in the bottom left is where that statement's going to fall.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Lorraine.
Oh, can I throw out a sentence
Absolutely.
Okay. Oh, how she loved to feel the earth beneath her feet.
Great sentence. Oh, how she loved to feel the earth beneath her feet. So where does that fit in concreteness?
Well, the way I imagine it
Right.
is, well, I guess I before that, she's kicked off her shoes,
Good.
and she's suddenly kicked off her shoes, and so I imagine it, that she's able to feel the ground, the grass, all the stickers, from the bushes, any little pebbles or rocks.
Good.
And I guess to me that seems concrete, but I guess maybe to say she feels it might be interpretive. So I can't tell. I
Well,
can't.
the word feel has multiple meanings, which is confusing. All right, but when you're talking about
Yeah.
feeling, that's concrete. When you're talking about I feel worried about this, that's a little different. Right? But if you just I feel the sand beneath my feet, that's absolutely concrete language.
Yeah.
Okay.
But she
Okay.
loved the feel.
And she loved to feel
Yeah.
that's that's interpretive, right?
Yeah.
The fact that she loved it. Now we have
Okay.
right? So we have high concreteness because of the sand beneath her feet. We also have high interpretation because we know that she loved it. It tells us she loved it. So it's going to be high and high. So it's going to be this upper right corner.
Okay.
Somebody else. Grappling with this is exactly the way to learn it.
Well, Doug, now I'm thinking about what we did just a little before, the John ate a bowl of cereal,
Good.
which is low interpretation and high concreteness, right? So it's over to the right, because you said to the left, but I'm looking at it, the arrow,
Oh,
what's that show?
say the statement again. I might have made a misspoke.
John ate a bowl of cereal.
I ate a bowl of cereal. So that is concrete. So it's somewhere over to the right,
Yes,
and it is low interpretive. So it's somewhere near the bottom.
correct. Got it. Okay, great.
Somewhere in the bottom right. If
Yeah.
I said something different.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, Sue.
The flowers smelled delightful.
Nice.
So that would be, let's see, kind of, it's low concrete and implicit interpretive.
Oh,
Because I'm
yeah.
just saying delightful. I didn't get into any. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. I really appreciate you bringing this one up. So the flowers smelled delightful, right? So all we're really talking about is the aroma of the flowers, right? That's what we're talking about, right? Now that is more concrete than if we said there was a delightful smell in the air, because we got the flowers there, and therefore we can imagine exactly the kind of smell it might have been within a range. So, in terms of concreteness, the flowers smelled delightful is actually fairly low in concreteness. It's not all the way down. It's not like it's sort of in the middle, I would say. So that is to say, in terms of concreteness, we're in the middle, going up somewhere in the up and down in the middle, and the flowers smelled delightful. Now the delightful is more on the highly interpretive end of it. Am I right about that? Yeah, delightful is telling us not just how they smelled, but that it was good, right? So in my mind, then we're left to right, we're in the middle, top to bottom, we're closer to the top. So we're somewhere in this little area. There's a central there's a little square there, just to the above and to the left of the arrow, and there's this one circle there that's in the middle of that area, and we're somewhere around there with that statement.
Yeah.
One more stab at this. Somebody give us a sentence or a pair of sentences or whatever. We'll try to place it on this square.
Trying to.
Okay. Oh, I just noticed that I can see on my phone where the arrow is if I move it around. So that's good. So I can use that instead of pointing with my finger. Duh.
The witch climbed up the tower and grabbed Rapunzel.
Good. The witch climbed up the tower and grabbed Rapunzel. So in concreteness, where is that?
It's concrete.
Yes, it's pretty high concrete.
Oh, it's high concrete.
So it's going to be in the right end of this square, right? Somewhere in the right
Correct.
side.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Well, up towards the top. Oh, I see. Never mind. Yes.
Now we have to ask: is it high or low in interpretive language? Say this thing again so that we can all
The witch climbed up the tower and grabbed Rapunzel.
Okay. So this took it the climbed. Is that interpretive at all or not? No.
And interpreted means beyond what it says? Or
Well, um, she climbed is pretty much a physical statement.
right.
You know, she struggled up. Now we get the physical, but we also get an interpretation of what it was like.
So not so interpretive.
That's right. It's low interpretive, which means that it's at the bottom of the square.
Uh-huh.
It's high concreteness, which means it's in the right. So it's in the right bottom corner of the square.
Uh-huh.
Does that help?
Yes.
And so you see why it's so friggin' confusing to try to do show don't tell, because they're two. It's not one thing. It's two things.
Yeah.
And you have to deal with them separately. And when you realize you can deal with them separately, then you've got a whole lot of new choices.
Cool. Ooh.
Anything else on this before we move toward a closing circle?
Can we have one more sentence?
Sure.
Which came to me. The water was crystal clear and ice cold, which sparked childhood memories of long forgotten life back in the North Pole.
Okay, read it again.
Oh,
I love it.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It just emerged, and can we analyze it shortly?
Can you say it again, Isabel? The weather was crystal clear and ice cold.
Which sparked childhood memories of long forgotten life back in the North Pole.
Ice cold.
Is it clear?
Long. It's very clear. Forgot.
Yep.
Childhood memories back in the North Pole. Great sentence, by the way. I love this sentence a lot. It's very engaging. All right. So there's kind of two halves to it, and they could have different levels of either of those. So the one half is the weather was crystal clear and ice cold. So let's just look at that. Is that concrete or more to the abstract?
Concrete.
It's concrete, right? So that means it would be over to the right-hand side of the square. Right? And what was the sentence? It's part of the sentence I just hit. How do you say?
Yes, the rest was
No, what was the part?
which sparked childhood memories of the long forgotten life back in the North Pole.
But the first part that we were just talking about,
the first part was the water was crystal clear and ice cold.
So the weather was crystal clear and ice cold. So that is high in concreteness. How is it in interpretive language? High or low? In the middle.
I think it's higher. It's crystal and ice.
Well, in my mind, those are more descriptive than interpretive.
Okay.
Ice is ice, right? You're not saying, you're just describing ice. Ice is ice, and so we know what it is. There's no interpretation there. It is just, when we think of ice, we think of something that's cold, and it's not something open to interpretation. So in my mind, the ice business is purely high in concreteness and low in interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we changed to the water was frightening cold.
Oh, now we're getting more interpretation, aren't we? Yes. Mm-hmm. How will move it? So just taking that part, the weather was frighteningly cold. Now we're getting a little bit, because how cold is frightening? Well, that's kind of up to you. So it's not without concreteness, but it's that part is relatively low in concreteness and relatively high in interpretive language.
Mhm.
So now we have something. The weather was frighteningly cold. Let's just take that. Now we're moving away from that lower right, I more toward the high interpretive. So it's moving up. Make sense?
Yep. Yes.
And the second half may fit in a different place on this. So we can take the second half if you want as well. But the two halves of sentences don't have to be in the same place. And the combination of two things in different places is actually sometimes very healing. Say your original statement again, Isabel.
Was the water, but it doesn't matter if it's water or weather.
Oh, the weather was crystal clear and ice cold. I wrote it down. Crystal clear and ice cold. So that is high concreteness, low interpretive,
Mhm.
which sparked long forgotten child memories of back in the North Pole. So now we have the long forgotten childhood memories in back of the North Pole. So how concrete is that? It's a good question. It's concrete in the sense that it's memory. I mean, memories are, are a little ethereal, but still, this is fairly concrete. These are the nature of the memories. So I might be reasoned with, but for me, the memory part is actually still pretty explicit
Mhm.
and low interpretive. And the back in the North Pole is giving us information that is suggesting the cold and so on, but is not explicitly describing it. So we're getting concrete stuff, but because of the nature of the North Pole, that's giving us a little sense of interpreting how cold it is. So for me, I would put this um, uh, uh, pretty low in the concreteness, but a little bit higher on the interpretive. So be over in the oh yeah, so you can kind of see where I'm moving the cursor around, right? It'd be somewhere over in this part of it. It wouldn't be at the very bottom because the interpretation is a little higher up. So it'd be somewhere maybe here, over toward the higher interpretive or middle interpretive, and but also over toward the higher concreteness. So my final verdict is something about where I'm putting it now. Does that make sense? Then when you spark the long forgotten child, it's a whole other thing. So we're over time. So unless there's any urgent question or just a question that's on your mind, last chance for those before we do closing circle. Last questions. Going. Gone. Okay, so let me just do this little wrap up. The widely quoted slogan "Show Don't Tell" is useful, but it has some basic problems. It is used to refer to two different things, which is like it's like saying be short, don't be heavy. We're talking about separate things, all right? The difference between concrete and summarized statements. So one thing is the difference between a concrete statement and summarized things. The other is the difference between pure description and interpretive language. And so when we say show, don't tell, we're talking about being on the concrete side and on the pure description side. That's the show. We're talking about telling, we're talking about being on the summarized and the interpretive language end. And that's why it's so dang confusing, because it's not one thing. If you've been confused, it has not been your fault. It's been people have talking to you as though it's a simple thing on a single line, and it's actually on 2 lines. And no wonder you can't figure out where it belongs on the line, because it doesn't belong just on any line. So you are absolved of any sense of not getting it because it's been said wrong. And on top of that, this show don't tell omits at least 2 important truths. One, there is a 2-dimensional continuum of options, right? Dimension this way, dimension this way. And much of the time, it's better to tell. Now, we haven't talked about that, but why is it sometimes better to tell? If you only showed, everything in your story was concrete, what would that do to the story? Nothing would stand out. You'd just be lost in details forever. It's like, is this still going on? Right? So if you never tell, you are going to end up with a cruddy story. So this show don't tell thing is really sloppy. There is something basic behind it, but now we're able to describe what that basic truth is. You get to choose where you are on this 2-dimensional continuum, where it belongs in the square. That's true. Everything else, based on the assumption that it's just a single adjustment, is misleading, false, and confusing. All right. Any questions or comments before we do close the circle? Going?
That was very enlightening for me. Thank you very much, Doug.
Great. Well, I'll take that as we're not going to go into this. We'll just go straight to the closing circle. What something you liked, learned, or found useful, and I think you began this off nicely. So, well, if you have something more you want to say, you can, but let's consider that at least good enough to get you off the hook on that. Someone else, something you liked, learned, or found useful from today. Sue.
It's like I finally kind of got it more today.
Good.
So that was good. And I was thinking about how I could apply this. And I was thinking about the paper I'm writing academically. And it's like, oh, it kind of helped me see it more clearly.
I'm so glad.
So that was good.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else is on besides Isabella.
Yes, and I realized why, because English is not my mother language, and I realized what's the difference between the first language and the second language. So it's the connection to emotions.
Yeah. Nice.
So this is what you helped me. I remember that our first conversation was about connection, and that this workshop helps connect. And now I can feel that very much, because it helps me connect emotions with the words, particular words.
Thank you.
In English. So yeah, it's
and I just want to give you an appreciation
precious
for doing this in your second language. It is, even you're excellent English speaker, but it's always harder. And so you have additional, and especially so much of this particular stuff is about explicit meanings of words, right? Because we're doing these categorizations. So this is probably one of the more difficult classes to take, not in your first language. And I just want to, first of all, appreciate you for doing it, and appreciate it for how well you're doing. You're really getting it. And that's what matters. And if it
Thank you for this appreciation. When I was in high school, I learned about Joseph Campbell. He's a Polish writer.
Yeah.
And he immigrated to United Kingdom.
I didn't know
and he was able to learn British English in a way that was totally amazing. And he was amazing British English speaker. And And I thought to myself back then, many, many years ago, that oh, this is my dream. I would like to know English like that and to write like him.
Sweet.
So thank you very much for this workshop.
Well, you're welcome, and we're giving you a chance to be exposed to some of the more abstract terms, which can be the more difficult, and grappling with them enough that you have a chance to get them uh, irrespective of the additional difficulties of doing it in a second language. So I'm so appreciative that you've stuck with it, and I'm so thrilled for you that it's starting to pay off. So good go. Go, Isabel, go. You're doing great.
Thank you.
I think we'll consider that the end. And I just want to thank you so much for sticking with this. I know that the graph aspect of it is unfamiliar to people who aren't into graphs, but it is actually the most concrete way I know to explain this. And so I appreciate you going with me to kind of learn to use the graph and learn to understand the graph, because I don't know a better way to represent it. And so, but it has required your patience and your perseverance, and I'm very grateful for that. And I'm excited to be able to give you something that most of the world is still clueless about. That this, in the absence of what you know about this, it's just confusing. Show, don't tell. But in the presence of this, it now means something. And it means two things, a combination of two things, which is one of the reasons it's so confusing. But you actually, the combination of those things does add up to something. And so you're not fluent at doing it easily. Hopefully by the end of the course, it'll be a lot easier for you to do it. It'll be more natural. But when you learn new vocabulary and new way of thinking, it takes a while. And so, A, thank you for sticking with it. B, I see it becoming more and more helpful as you do stick with it. So I'm appreciative of both of you, and look forward to seeing 4 next week.
Thank you, Doug. That was great.
You're welcome. You guys.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Sue. See you next week.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.